Hello students, here in this video lecture I will describe French Revolution. Members of a society are governed by certain rules and regulations. It is a universal fact that human beings are usually not happy to live within regulations, as these impinge on the basic idea of freedom to do anything. But rules and regulations are needed for any civilized society to maintain order. Some rules may suit some sections of the society but may not be acceptable to others. Thus, some amount of resentment is always present in any society. These resentments often lead to conflicts. Members of a society tend to rise against those forming the rules when they feel oppressed or feel that their basic right to freedom is curtailed, and they are not getting the right to equality in status, an opportunity for growth and justice. Some people lead protests against existing governments irrespective of the latter having been legally constituted. When protests turn into mass movements which are simply aimed to overthrow the government, they are called revolution. Mass movements against the existing government may be non-violent or violent in nature. The various countries of the world have seen revolutions of different magnitudes, which have brought about large-scale changes in the form of change in government or their constitutions. One of the most famous revolutions in world history is the French Revolution. So we shall study about it in this chapter through this video lecture.
The French Revolution of 1789 occurred on a backdrop of social inequality, economic despair, and political breakdown. In the 18th century, the French society was divided into three estates. The first estate consisted of the clergy, that is, the persons invested with special functions in the church. The second estate comprised of the nobles, who were typically rich and owned hereditary property. The third and largest estate included the common people, most of whom were peasants. The people of the third estate were the only members of society who had to pay taxes. While peasants comprised 90% of the population, very few owned the land they cultivated, and most had to work for the first two estates at fixed low wages. All members of the third estate had to pay a direct tax to the state called taille. The peasants had to additionally pay taxes to the church called tithes and feudal dues to the nobility. The economic situation of the common French people was worsened by an indifferent monarchy. When Louis XVI became the King of France in 1774, he found a treasury emptied by long years of war. The extravagant expenses of maintaining the court at Versailles further drained the state, which now faced a debt of more than 2 billion livres. Under Louis XVI, France also helped the American colonies gain independence from British rulers, and this war effort added another billions livres in debt. Lenders to the state now began to charge a 10% interest on loans, raising the liabilities of the state. To meet these rising expenses, King Louis XVI increased the taxes on an already burdened third estate. The final straw was the subsistence crisis. The population of France had risen much faster than the production of food grains. Prices of bread and food grains soared while the wages of peasants remained fixed. With growing despair, groups of peasants and workers broke out in spontaneous revolts. But these groups lacked the resources to bring about any major change. At this time, a certain section of the Third Estate had turned prosperous through trade and other professions, and this group had access to education and new ideas. This new educated middle class believed that people should be privileged by merit, not by birth. The philosophers among them expressed the idea of a society based on freedom, equal laws, and equal opportunities for all people. John Locke, for example, wrote 2 treatises of government in which he rejected the doctrine of divine or absolute rights of the king. Jean-Jacques Rousseau proposed a government based on a social contract between people and their representatives. Montesquieu, in his book, The Spirit of the Laws, advised a division of power within the government between legislative, executive, and judiciary bodies. These ideas were discussed in salons and coffee houses. They were circulated through pamphlets and newspapers, which were often read aloud in groups for those who could not read. More and more people began to question the current order, and so the revolution began.
In the 18th century, the French feudal society was divided into 3 estates. The first and second estates were made up of the clergy and the nobility. Those in the third estate, the common people, were the only members of society who had to pay taxes. Although peasants in the third estate made up of almost 90% of the population, only a small number owned the land they cultivated. An estates general meeting had not been held since 1614. However, on May the 5th, 1789, the French king, Louis XVI, called the meeting of the Estates General to pass a law for new taxes. The Estates General was a political body to which the 3 estates sent their representatives. The delegates met at a hall in Versailles. The first and second estate members could sit, but the third estate delegates, comprising prosperous and educated people of the third estate, had to stand at the back. Entry to the assembly was banned for peasants, artisans, and women. King Louis XVI called this meeting because he wanted to conduct the voting as it had been in the past, with the 3 estates voting as individual bodies, having 1 vote each. The third estate demanded that instead of voting by estate, they should vote by head, and every member should vote. When the king rejected this idea, the members of the third estate left the meeting in protest. The royal officials locked the regular meeting hall, but on June 20th, 1789, members of the third estate assembled in the king's indoor tennis court hall at Versailles. This group called themselves a National Assembly. They declared that they represented the French nation and took an oath not to disperse until a constitution was drafted limiting the powers of the monarch. This oath came to be known as the Tennis Court Oath. The National Assembly was led by Mirabeau and Abbe Sieyès. Mirabeau was from a noble family, but he wanted to change the feudal society. Abbe Sieyès was originally a priest. He wrote a very influential pamphlet called What is the Third Estate?, criticizing the clerical and noble privileges. On the morning of July the 14th, 1789, the city of Paris was at breaking point. A bad winter and poor harvests had resulted in high bread prices. To make matters worse, some bakers were hoarding supplies and the people were agitated. Angry at being made to queue for hours, crowds stormed into the Paris shops. Meanwhile, the king ordered troops into Paris, which started a rumor among the people that the soldiers were going to attack the citizens. 7,000 protesting men and women gathered in front of the town hall. They broke into government buildings, looking for arms to protect themselves from the troops. A furious mob of several hundred attacked the royal fortress prison, Bastille. The commander of the Bastille was killed and the prisoners were released. To the rioting mob, this hated fortress represented all that was wrong and unjust in France. The angry crowds pulled it apart and celebrated its destruction. The fall of the Bastille is considered as one of the greatest symbols of the revolution itself. In the French countryside, peasants were frightened by a rumor that the lords of the manors were sending an army of brigands to destroy their crops. Caught up in this frenzy of fear, the peasants revolted and attacked the chateau of their lords. As the rumor and fear spread from village to village, peasants burnt the manorial documents that had records of their feudal obligations. As a result of the spread of this great fear, nobles fled from their homes. Faced with these violent revolts, Louis XVI had to finally acknowledge the National Assembly. He accepted that his powers would now only be limited by the new constitution. On the night of August the 4th, 1789, the National Assembly abolished the feudal system, and the old system of feudal privileges and unjust taxes was over. Land owned by the church was confiscated and members of the clergy gave up their privileges. In 1791, the National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution. The new Constitution took away the absolute power of the king, separated the constitutional powers and distributed these between the legislature, executive and judiciary. France thus became a constitutional monarchy. Under the new constitution, the Legislative Assembly had the power to enact laws and raise taxes. However, voting in the Assembly excluded the poor and was restricted to upper and middle classes in the French society. The king and his ministers held executive power but were answerable to the Assembly. The judiciary was independent of both the legislature and executive. The National Assembly's new constitution began with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This listed and protected every citizen's rights. The declaration stated that all men have equal rights under law and gave the world its creed of human rights: liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Despite the new constitution of 1791, France remained in a state of turmoil. Along with King Louis XVI, the nobles and the clergy started a counter-revolution to regain their status. Support from the neighboring countries was also sought. King Louis XVI entered a secret pact with Prussia to crush the Third Estate's revolution. Anticipating their move, the new National Assembly of France declared war against Prussia and Austria. Large sections of the French population joined the war of the people against kings and aristocracies across Europe. Like all wars, the Revolutionary War too brought difficult times and a severe economic crisis. Men spent most of their time fighting wars. Women had to earn a living and look after their families. Enraged by poverty, people from less prosperous sections of society began to form small political clubs to discuss government policies and plan a course of action. The Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, formed one of the most prominent of these clubs. Many Jacobins started wearing long striped trousers like dock workers. They became famous as sans culottes, which meant those without the knee breeches. It was a way to proclaim that power was no longer restricted to the nobles who typically wore knee breeches. Men also wore a red cap that symbolized liberty. The assembly voted to imprison the royal family and later sentenced King Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, to death. On 21st September 1792, the convention abolished monarchy and declared France a republic. As a republic, France no longer had a king. The people of France would be ruled by a government elected by them. France continued to face political upheavals in the years that followed, but the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity had taken root and had begun to inspire similar ideologies and political movements in various parts of Europe and the world.
The French Revolution of 1789 has had a major impact in shaping ideologies and movements, not only in France, but also on the modern world. A society based on privileges gave way to a new system of governance, with the establishment of a legislature, executive, and judiciary. France thus became a constitutional monarchy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen during the Revolution announced the coming of a new time as it promoted the ideals of liberty and democracy. The revolution gave the world the basis of human rights through its slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The idea that all individuals had rights and could claim equality was responsible for changing the role and position of women in society. It also led to abolition of slave trade that was rampant in most of the colonies up until the 19th century. These notions of equality and freedom emerged as the central ideas of the anti-colonial movements in countries like India and Africa. The condition of women gradually improved during the early years of the revolutionary government. Not only were schools created, but schooling for girls was made compulsory. They could no longer be forced to marry against their will. Marriage was in the form of a contract and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal, and law was made equal for both men and women. Women could train for jobs, become artists, or start their own business. Yet, women were not given the political rights. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banned their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Olympe de Gouges was one of such revolutionary women. She protested against the fact that women were not given representation in the newly drafted constitution. She wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women in 1791. In 1793, when she criticized the Jacobin government for forcibly closing down women's clubs, she was tried, charged with treason, and was executed. The fight for political rights for French women continued for decades to come. It was finally in 1946 women in France won the right to vote. France had its colonies in the Caribbean islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Santo Domingo. These colonies were major suppliers of commodities like tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the Europeans were not willing to go and work in a far-off and unfamiliar place. This led to shortage of labor in the plantations. This led to the development of a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast. Here they would buy slaves from local chieftains. These slaves were then branded and packed tightly in a ship and brought to Caribbean islands after a 3-month-long journey and sold to plantation owners. These slaves were exploited to meet the demand for goods like sugar, coffee, and indigo in the European market. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes flourished due to the successful slave trade business. Slave trade flourished throughout the 18th century as no concrete attempts were made to make it illegal. Finally, the convention in 1794 declared all slaves free. But this was short-lived as Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Slavery was abolished in all French colonies in 1848.
The French Revolutionary Wars saw the growth of power of Napoleon Bonaparte in France. Thereafter, a number of conflicts took place between France under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte and the other European nations in the early part of the 18th century. This series of wars were called the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, slowly brought almost all of Europe under his rule. A decade after the wars, the ideologies of Napoleon still existed. Napoleon's European conquests helped to spread the ideas of freedom and nationalism to other parts of Europe. During the conquests, Napoleon's armies carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality with them. These wars helped to overthrow despotic governments, liberate people, and set up republican governments. But as he won over countries, he started enforcing the French style of rule on the conquered nations. In the name of liberation, he had turned into a tyrant. This attitude of Napoleon gave birth to a feeling of nationalism among the people who had been conquered by him. They feared their own cultures being wiped out and resented the effect of French occupation of their lands. The old style of loyalty towards rulers was replaced by a loyalty towards one's own country. This resulted in the rising spirit of nationalism among the people who could now be called nationalists. This growth of spirit of nationalism eventually led to the defeat and exile of Napoleon. But by then, Napoleon had already laid the foundation for the ideas of freedom and nationalism. After the rule of Napoleon, though no major war was fought, struggles between the liberals, nationalists, and despotic rulers began taking place. The liberals wanted everyone to have freedom of thought, speech and expression, right to equality, and the right to elect their own government. While the nationalists believed that the interest of the country was more important than that of the individual, they envisioned their nation as being stable, strong, united, and being its own ruler. Many revolutions broke out throughout Europe in 1848 as a result of these ideas. These same ideas of nationalistic feelings instigated the Italians and the Prussians to fight and eventually form their own nations.